Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what we hope is the first of several sessions that we have diving into very specific sectors of the venture ecosystem. My name is Thanasis, or Thani for short, Delistathis, and I'm a managing partner and co-founder of Proof, which is an expansion stage venture capital firm. The goal is basically with these sessions is to bring into the public discourse things and trends that we see around specific sectors happening on the ground, and maybe some ways that investors may be thinking about investing in these sectors, like different frameworks and how to think about it. There's obviously a lot of content around all of these things that we're going to cover, but we're trying to consolidate and give you, a view, and then link to additional resources as needed. It is my pleasure today to have as a guest on this discussion Phil Bronner, who is a managing partner and co-founder of Ardent Venture Partners. So Phil, do you want to say a few things about you and your fund?
Yeah, sure. Well, first, thanks for having me, Thanasis. Longtime friend, pillar of the venture market. It's just exciting to have the opportunity to discuss AI with you. So as you mentioned, I am a managing partner and co-founder of Ardent Venture Partners. We're an early stage, high conviction, thesis-driven fund. And so just to take each one of those separately, so high conviction means that we have a limited number of deals in our portfolio. So we may have anywhere between 15 and 20. We go early stage, so we'll back to folks who are founding a new company all the way through some of our deals that have a few million in revenue. And then we're heavily thesis driven. And so we go very deep in targeted areas, one of which is artificial intelligence. The other is embedded financial services and fintech. And so very excited to talk to you about AI.
Awesome. And just a few words about Proof for those of you that don't know our firm. We invest in high-performing, hyper-growth companies that typically raise very competitive rounds. So we access these rounds in partnership with seed, early-stage funds and investors like Phil, who have access but do not always have the capital to continue investing. And in exchange for facilitating access, we share our economics with these funds that bring us into the opportunities. This session is starting with AI, and AI is obviously one of the hottest sectors right now into the ecosystem out there, and so we thought it was topical and appropriate to talk about it. There are a bunch of slides. We did some work. I did the work over the spring with an MBA candidate from Columbia University, Sam Barron, who unfortunately couldn't join us for the session today. We will make those slides available through LinkedIn to everyone, so you can look at them at your own time. I'm not going to go through all the slides of this report. It's meant to more weave a storyline and trigger a conversation with Phil, and we hope to leave some time at the end for discussion. We're also recording this session and we're going to put it back on LinkedIn, so that if you need to go back and look at any sections, you can go and look at it again. So with that, let me just screen share and let me find the button to screen share here. Okay. Here we go. So specific in AI, we're going to talk about generative AI, and there's a page here that goes through the history. We're not going to go through that today, but it's basically an evolution of AI into a model that is able to now, for the first time, create content as opposed to analyze content and extract insights. So the first question that we wanted to discuss is why now, right? We always ask, like, why this, why now? And so there's three things that we basically saw when we're digging into this, and they have to do with, first, AI functionality. There were some critical discoveries and innovations that came up in the last 8 years or so with the transformer architecture and some other things in deep learning and neural networks that, for the first time, allowed the AI models to be able to deal with various forms of data, et cetera. So that's one. Second is data access, right? As software has penetrated more and more sectors, and we're going to talk a little bit about where generative AI is particularly a good fit for, and that data is now becoming available, and generative AI is basically requires a massive amounts of data to be able to train the models. And finally, it's the availability of compute, right? Computing had to reach to the point where you can digest and interpret massive amounts of data. And I'm showing this picture at the bottom here, which is basically a timeline dating back to the 1950s. It's a logarithmic scale. So even though it looks like a straight line, it's really an exponential curve. And when you look at the last 2 or 3 years even, you can see that the scale, and this is basically, it's a way of, it's floating point operations, which is basically a geeky way of saying amount of computing power that goes into analyzing these models. And these models are getting more and more complex. And in the last 3 or 4 years, you've seen a factor of 4 increase. That's 10,000x increase in the computing power that is going towards going after these models. So Phil, I don't know if you want to add anything to this, but that's how that's how we thought about it.
No, I think this is 100% accurate.
Yeah. McKinsey last year did a lot of work. So why are people like paying attention? And obviously, from a consumer standpoint, everybody's imagination kind of was, suddenly everybody was captured by what is happening in generative AI, and the reason was ChatGPT. But generative AI has implications about business. So McKinsey went about quantifying some of this potential impact, and they studied 63 use cases across a variety of industries and a variety of functions. And their estimates are that generative AI can generate as much as 2.6 trillion to 4.4 trillion economic value on an annual basis, right? In just these 63 use cases. And if you factor in the associated human labor efficiencies that come from using that technology, it's actually double that. So this is basically why it is such a big trend, and maybe even the biggest trend to date in venture investing, because technology now has the ability to significantly impact economic value creation across a number of industries. And Phil, I'm sure you know this study, and do you think that this is true? Have you seen anything in your companies that make this particularly valid?
Yes, 100. Yes, definitely. And so, just to frame this and to frame my comments, as I mentioned, we're a thesis-driven fund, and we do a tremendous amount of research in the areas in which we invest. And so, we had been active in AI, predictive AI, prior to the release of ChatGPT in November 2022. But since that time, we've really gone deep in generative AI. And at this point, we've looked at 3,500 plus companies. We've met with 300 plus founders. And a lot of the trends come from what we've seen in evaluating those deals. And so the first point I would make is the reason folks are so excited about this on the venture side is because when you look at an enterprise, 20% of the data is structured. So that means it sits in an Excel spreadsheet or it sits in a database, and that drives the enterprise software market globally. And right now, that's $150 billion market, and it's growing at 10%. 80% is unstructured, and by unstructured, what we mean is that it's sitting in a PowerPoint, it's sitting in an email, it's sitting in a PDF, and so it's being stored in a database, but software doesn't understand it, right? And so it doesn't understand what's being written in those documents. For the first time, large language models and generative AI enable software to understand what's in there. And so it understands an email, it understands a PDF. And when you think about what software does, software automates business processes, and it leverages data to do that. And so understanding unstructured data allows for software to automate business processes that sit on top of unstructured data. And unstructured data is 80% of the data in the enterprise. And so that's very exciting. The other piece to it is, right now, when you think about the way you engage with software, how do you do it? You do it in a structured way. And so you either click a button on a website or you type into a field on on the web or in a software application. Now, through natural language and through images and through PDFs, you can now communicate with software in a multimodal way. And so it's not only that software understands unstructured data, it's also opening up the way we communicate with software in a multimodal way and the way it communicates with us. And so it creates a massive opportunity.
Got it. Yeah, and this is what we see as well as the potential. And so this is basically point number one, bullet number one, about why venture capital is paying attention to this impact, right? Because you have the ability to now use software and technology to change the way a lot of industries perform their, operate and do their business. And so that basically has attracted the attention of VCs. Now, let me go through a few slides talking about what the state of the market is in terms of venture capital into generative AI. And so there's a lot of content on this page, but basically the main point to take away is look at the chart bottom right. And that is the chart of total investment into various parts of technology. And the point is that generative AI is just getting started, right? And AI in general. And when you look at the amount of investment that is going into it relative to the opportunity of potential gains that are available to companies that do well, it's really small looking relative to Web 3.0. So it's $50 billion annual investment. I'm sorry, $30 billion annual investment. And you have cloud being $200 billion and 5G being $500 billion, right? So it's still a very small amount of capital relative to other sectors of the technology market. And obviously, the expectation is that this is going to rise dramatically. So the projection is that it's going to rise at a 37% CAGR, faster than any other segment of the technology market, to get to 400 billion by the end of this decade. So huge growth, huge opportunity. That's why VCs are paying attention. And you are already beginning to see some very massive rounds being done for companies. Obviously, everybody knows OpenAI, but there are many others that have raised a lot of capital. And you're beginning to see a number of exits in this space because companies are now beginning to be acquisitive. Larger enterprises, don't want to be left behind, so they're beginning to open up their purse and acquire companies. One of our companies from Fund One, actually here is listed here, Casetext, which was a legal AI assistant in essence, and that was sold last year. When you look at valuations, as you would expect, valuations have risen dramatically, especially in the last year, but even as you look at it relative to 2020. So at the late stage, over a 4-year period, valuations have gone up 525%. And if you just look at 22 to 23, which is the latest year that we had data for, it was up 172%. And even though the numbers may not be as high in the early stage market, they're still up 250% and 68% respectively. So across the board, investors are getting excited. There's huge demand because of the big idea here, right? Which is to be early and to be one of the first companies to take advantage of the potential of this technology. And so when you look at the total amount of dollars going in, you also see a big increase, right? Valuations are going up, a lot of money is going up. And so every other venture sector has basically gone down. But generative AI has increased dramatically. And even if, you can see the huge increase in 2023 3 from the prior 2 years. And 21 for most, was the highest amount of capital going out from VCs. Even relative to that is high. And even if you actually take out like the biggest rounds that happen for AI in many of the big LLM large language model companies, you can see that it's still an increase over 2022. So even though many sectors have corrected, AI has gone up significantly. And it's actually just anecdotally, it was interesting because we were looking at the deal flow automation tool that basically picks up signals from various data sources online about what VCs are looking at. And so as we were digging into it, we wanted to see what some of the biggest investors in venture are looking at. It was basically 90% was related to AI. So that, and Phil, I'd be interested. I mean, you obviously don't just invest in AI, but what percentage of your activity would you say is driven by AI versus other sectors?
Probably 80% right now.
80%, yeah. So that's very consistent with a lot of the other VCs that we see, right?
Yep.
Okay, so then when you look at AI, what are some of the ways to think about it? And there's a lot of sources online about this. By the way, all the sources for this study are listed at the end of this presentation, so you can go back and look at them. But the way we're at least thinking about it is that there's various layers, and this is kind of the framework that we're thinking. There's infrastructure, which is basically the computing resources and other tools that are necessary to create the large language models and technologies to make this a success. And that, we think, is best left to the really large technology companies that dominate the cloud space. So AWS, Microsoft's Azure, and Google Cloud are kind of big players in this, as is obviously NVIDIA and others. Then you have kind of the large general purpose foundational models like OpenAI's ChatGPT or Google's Gemini. And again, that it's very tough, I think, to play in that space because it requires massive amounts of capital, because you have to basically put the computing resources together necessary to train these models. And when you train it into billions of data points, the price tag gets really high. And so that, I think, will, and in fact, I would argue a lot of companies that have an early lead in that space may be able to dominate that space because, you're just that much further ahead from others that are behind. Over time, obviously, we think computing resources spend will come down as there's more efficiency, but right now it's just difficult to play in that market unless you are ready to put a lot of dollars to work. There's a couple of areas where we think it's more interesting for kind of like early to mid-stage VCs to play, and that's horizontal platforms and tools. And well, actually, one thing in addition, I wanted to mention about the foundational models there. You're beginning to now see some LLMs that are more verticalized. So I think that might be an exception to the rule. So for example, there's a company like Poolside, which is trying to come in and create a model for automating software development for software companies. So I think there's less of a capital expenditure that goes into those kind of models because the training models have to be applied to a more contained universe as opposed to OpenAI, which is kind of digesting everything. So that could be an opportunity, but then the other two sectors are more interesting. So horizontal platforms, these are companies that basically have a technology that can apply across different functional areas, across industries, and automate workflows. So we, last year and earlier this year, made an investment in a company called Hercules AI that has these kind of multi-agent models that can digest data with specific use cases and then just automate previously manual processes that were very expensive or not even doable in some cases because they were so expensive relative to the the value add that you would get from performing it. And then I think the area where most VCs are going to play is in the application specific to a vertical market. And those are more targeted vertical applications that go after a specific market. It's companies like Casetext, which I mentioned earlier, which was in our portfolio, that basically went after the legal market. Or companies like we invested last year in Rad AI, which is a workflow automation solution for radiologists. And they just basically have a way of making the radiologist's job easier, more efficient, saves them 1 to 2 hours a day, and that is a very powerful economic bargain for a very expensive resource. I know, Phil, you also have Pilot Desk, so maybe you can. So I'd love to get your thought about, is this the right way to think about it, or do you have a different approach? And maybe talk about Pilot Desk as well, which I know is one of your companies.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the way we think about it. And the only things I would add, so at the foundational model level, as you mentioned, I think that's going to be limited to the hyperscaler companies like the Googles and the OpenAIs and Amazons of the world. But there's costs that limits the ability for people to compete at that layer, but also it's access to talent, right? And so at that layer, there's probably, I don't know, 3,000-4,000 people in the world who really, really matter. And probably 600 to 800 of them are at OpenAI. Probably 400 or 500 of them are at Google. Anthropic is another place, maybe a couple hundred of them are there. And it's just very difficult to get access to that talent. And so in addition to GPUs limiting the ability for people to compete at that layer, it's also talent. We definitely are spending a lot of time on the horizontal platform and tools as well as applications. What I would say here is what's really interesting about generative AI and large language models is the application layer and the platform layer are sort of blending together, specifically when you look at low-code applications. And we believe this is happening for a number of reasons. One, the cost of development is going down, and so the cost of customization of software is going down. Also, the ability to create these sort of low-code tools is just improving tremendously. And so you can provide tools out of the box that are low-code that you can customize easily, but they're verticalized. And so they look sort of like applications, they look sort of like infrastructure, and we believe that's going to be very interesting. As you mentioned, we have a company, Pilot Desk, in this area. They're focused on ad operations. So ad operations is a heavily manual process right now, and their tool leverages both predictive AI as well as generative AI to automate a lot of those workflows. We're aggressively looking at other companies that are very similar. I'd say on the infrastructure side, a lot of folks are familiar with the RPA area, companies like Appian and others. With large language models and generative AI, you can enhance those platforms and solve more complex workflows in a relatively easy way. And so we think that's going to be a very interesting area of opportunity as well.
Got it. We have a question, and feel free, by the way, to use the chat function of the webinar to submit questions. We'll take them when the discussion comes up to the relevant points. But I think this is an interesting one. How do your valuations around metrics take into account the in-kind investments from cloud vendors like Microsoft, NVIDIA, Google, and AWS? So what he or she is talking about here is the idea that a lot of these larger entities that control the compute infrastructure may either make direct nominal investment in the form of compute and get equity for it, or more often, actually, making a large investment in the company. So Microsoft's case, an investment into OpenAI, and OpenAI just turns right back and buys a lot of compute from Microsoft. It is what it is, right? I think it's a value for value calculation. Obviously, it's much more efficient to buy these computing resources from the likes of AWS, Microsoft, and others than to try to rebuild the infrastructure to control it directly. And I think some of those deals can be pretty lucrative because strategically, we've seen this in another company where one of these big players aligned strategically with the company that was buying the compute resources and made those compute resources available at a very attractive rate, which I would argue makes it a good bargain for the startups that can do that. So, Phil, do you have the same thought on this, or how are you thinking about it?
Yeah, same thought. For companies that we back, often, getting access to compute is very important. We're not backing companies that need hundreds of millions of dollars of compute, but early stage companies, are often capital constrained. And so having the ability to get access to resources from large companies is critically important. It allows you to allow your dollars to carry you further.
Yep. There's a lot of discussion online about is this kind of a slippery market? And we'll discuss a lot of the risks associated with with this market. But as technology gets better, if the switching costs are not high, you might have a better mousetrap, so to speak, come in and totally take over a market. And we've seen some of that online. And the technology is also advancing at such a rate where it's really important. So I'm not going to go into all of these, but as we think about companies and making investment in these companies, I think you have to have some combination of a number of these criteria to be able to create a company that's sustainable and create so-called moat around it to make the business, defensible in the long term. And, I'll just mention a couple, and maybe Phil, you can talk about some other ones or give some examples maybe from some of your companies. So flywheel effect, there's a lot of discussion around, and we've heard this from a number of companies. Being early in this market is super important because there's a flywheel effect. The one who starts early gets access to early data, is able to continue to iterate. And of course, you have to continue to iterate and build better models. And that creates an even bigger barrier to entry for others. Another significant point is having, especially in the areas of applications, having vertical domain expertise and technical expertise is super important, because that is what allows you to tailor that solution specifically to the needs of an industry. And I'll throw in a company that we saw in the market, NIM Health. NIM basically takes a very manual process, which is when you go to a hospital and you see a doctor, there's notes that doctor makes, and that those notes have to be translated into codes to be able to charge the insurance companies. That is a very complicated system, and there's very expensive coders that do this manually. So they read it. They may have over time, there have been a number of efforts to kind of build AI assisted tools for these coders to do this more efficiently. But NIM is actually trying to do it to a much larger degree on an automated basis, leveraging generative AI. Phil, maybe you can give a couple of other factors that you think make a company more defensible. I mean, do you even buy into this, that you need to have these things? How are you thinking about building defensibility into a startup?
Yeah, for sure. So just to take a step back, let's talk a bit about where we are in the evolution of generative AI, and that'll help to frame my comments. And so, ChatGPT launches November 2022, and when you look at the first wave of companies, it reminded me, and you were investing at this time as well, Thanasis, of the early days of when the iPhone came out. So iPhone comes out, and immediately we all knew it was a magical device. And as a result, there were a number of companies that were started. Now, that first wave of companies were not the ones that became the household names over time. And the reason they weren't was there were two reasons. So first, there was no infrastructure that was in place. And so if you were building an application company, you had to build both the application as well as the infrastructure. Second thing, it takes time for founders and investors to understand a new medium, right? And so during that first year to 18 months, founders are figuring that out. So the same thing happened when ChatGPT came out. We all thought it was, magical experience. A number of founders started companies, but that first wave of companies mainly were sort of thin applications that were sitting on top of ChatGPT, and there was no infrastructure in place. And so that's when a lot of the questions around moats and, whether you can build differentiation in this space came up. As folks started to get their arms around the medium, what you started to see was that the moats that are being built now are very similar to the moats that were being built in, around, traditional SaaS and other B2B, opportunities. And so if you get back to my frame, which was, look, enterprise software, automates a business process leveraging data. Before, you were leveraging structured data. Now you can leverage structured data as well as unstructured data. When you look at what you're backing, you're still backing, folks that have deep domain expertise, that are going after a complex business process, leveraging, in this case, structured and unstructured data. And so those are the type of businesses that we like to see. And the moat, as you have here, comes from either that deep domain expertise, it comes from the proprietary data. In this instance, we haven't talked about it yet, but folks know that these models hallucinate. And so to solve business problems, folks have to, bridge the gap between the foundational models and improving accuracy for the end user. And so that creates a moat for new companies as well. Security,
Talk a
privacy,
little
and
bit about that, because I think that's actually a really interesting area, because in an enterprise application, and I know we saw it in a couple of our companies, there's no, 95% is not good enough. 99% is not good enough. Some of these processes,
exactly.
you have to be 100%, right? You have to 100% sure. So how do companies go about that? Because it's an interesting technical issue that I think is getting addressed by a number of companies.
It is. And so, and two things I'll say here. So first, when folks initially looked at this space and they were looking at how do you build moats and, how can you build an attractive business, they thought it was easy to do, right? Because you're putting these thin layers on top of applications. One of the things that we're starting to see, and I'm sure you're seeing it in your companies as well, to do this well is really hard, right? Like, it's not easy. We're at the top of the first inning. This is going to take decades to roll out. It's going to be 30, 40 years before this rolls out fully across the enterprise because it's hard to do, right? So as you think about just the accuracy point, right? There are a number of things you can do to improve accuracy. Yeah, because you have, like, accuracy is an issue, cost is an issue. We haven't talked about that yet, but let's start with accuracy. So accuracy, you can take a model, right? And you can train it, right? To enhance it, to improve accuracy. You can use RAG to improve accuracy, which is basically taking other structured data that's targeted at a specific domain and leveraging that to improve your prompt. There's something called structured outputs that also improves your accuracy. And so what does that mean? So let's say you have a model and you want that model to return a date, right? If it hallucinates, what it turns out probably won't be a date. And so if you structure the output to only look for a date, it allows you to sort of improve the accuracy in that way. So there are a number of different ways to improve accuracy, but also, as opposed to being in an autonomous sort of environment where you expect the model to fully operate without human intervention, a lot of what we're seeing right now are co-pilots, where the model isn't the final arbiter on the answer. The model provides the answer to an individual who then can either massage the answer or take it and leverage it to solve a particular problem. In that instance, the model or the platform is making the user much more efficient. So that's what we're seeing in the coding area.
Yeah, I think we've definitely seen that, and we've seen I think two flavors of how people address this. Number one is what you talked about, which is when there's a certain threshold of uncertainty, you just kick it off to an individual who's much, human, who's much more able to judge, or give them the associated information and tools to be able to judge. The other one that I thought was interesting is this whole kind of multi-agent approach
Mhm.
to checking data. So in essence, the way that works is you have a model that does the work, and then you have a separate model, and sometimes we've seen two or three separate models that check the results of the first model. So going through iterations, and then when you train the second or third model, you basically train them on data and how to verify the data, which I thought was pretty interesting. So that's an
Absolutely.
active area of research right now in the market.
Yep. 100%.
So we have a question that I think could be interesting here. So is there a reason to be concerned about A, too much capital chasing the area, resulting in bad allocations, and B, overcapacity in LLM infrastructure investment? And I'm going to guess that this is probably an LP asking this kind of question. So do you want to take a first cut at this one?
Yeah, anytime you have, and again, we both have been through this movie before, when you have a new sort of infrastructure, element. So whether you're going from on-prem to cloud, or you have the mobile phone that comes out, um, that creates a net new industry. You often have this hype cycle, right? Like you have this, sort of, hey, wow, there's all these opportunities around this new technology. So I'd say the last 2 years has been sort of the hype cycle, right? We all sort of can see the potential of this technology, and as a result, a lot of dollars are going into it. I don't know if you're feeling this, but I'm starting to feel us sort of starting to come down a little bit, like going towards that valley of that trough of disillusionment that often happens with new technology. I expect that to occur over the next 12 to 18 months. A lot of dollars have gone in, a lot of dollars have went into companies, in that first phase that I talked about, and many of those companies will not be successful. But again, this happens every time a new technology comes out. Now, as you're in that valley of disillusionment that I expect over the next 12 to 18 months, that's actually a great time to invest because that's the time where infrastructure is starting to fall into place, when founders are starting to understand the new technology, and great companies are founded and funded. And so when you look at the mobile phone, that valley of disillusionment happened for the mobile phone about 2 years after the iPhone was introduced. And that's when the Ubers and the DoorDashes of the world were founded. And so I expect the same thing to happen here. A lot of dollars went in, a lot of those companies won't do well. They won't meet their expectations. As a result, you're going to move into that valley of disillusionment. Those who continue to focus in the area are going to back really interesting companies. And then 12 to 18 months from now, you'll start to really see companies take off.
Right. Yeah. I agree with you. I say I haven't yet seen evidence that this is beginning to correct. And perhaps you're seeing it much earlier, maybe as you're looking at early stage. I think it's hard not to have an overinvestment, frankly, because you see the potential outcome opportunity that you have here, and the you see a new technology that has the potential to change so many industries, and you have to invest, right? And especially when you have dynamics where you have to be early in the market. I think it's really murky, and it's going to take time for people to realize how to play in this industry, and for investors to learn how to ask the right questions to identify the companies that are better. So, and we've seen a lot of companies have failed already, companies that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars. And so that's nothing new in technology. I will say it's a lot more. People have lived through .com and have lived through other cycles, in the 08-09 crisis. And so I think investors are asking smarter questions, but there's definitely a sense of exuberance still.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add, just in terms of, as I said, I think we're sort of cresting a little bit. Definitely the bar for Gen AI deals at the early stage has gone up, whereas before just a broad set of companies in the exact same sector were being backed. Now I'm seeing folks being much more judicious and evaluating these opportunities. The only other thing I would say is, what's really exciting about the generative AI opportunities that we're seeing is you can really see the ROI associated with these things. And so although it's still early and although we're still trying to figure it out in some areas, like the opportunity is clear, And so it's really exciting to see that at such an early stage of the phase of this technology, and I think it bodes well over time.
Yeah, for sure. And in fact, it's interesting that you mentioned that because a company that we looked at had, was charging what would be considered very healthy amount for a recurring revenue software. And what they realized is that the value they were adding was hundreds of times higher than what they were charging. So the conversation was, gee, how do we better design our business model to capture some of that value that we're adding? Because it was almost like ridiculous. So I think you're going to see a lot of that, and it will take time to calibrate.
Yeah. And the only other thing I'd say too is like, and I know you're seeing this as well, like, this technology has been around a couple years. Some of these companies are growing very fast, like
Right.
very fast, in both the B2C space as well as the B2B area. And so, like, again, that's like they're growing at a pace that I haven't seen before. And so that's
For sure.
exciting as well.
For sure. We have a couple of other questions, but let me just advance, and I think we'll catch them a little bit later. So, one question that we wanted to look at is what are some, and McKinsey has done some work on this, their study, which I would encourage everybody to look at, cover some of this, but what are the functional areas of the enterprise that are more likely to adopt generative AI as a solution or as a tool? And we list 4 here. So customer operations, again, functions that deal with a lot of data, right? And are typically driven by humans and therefore expensive. So customer operations, sales, and marketing, where again, it's a function that is looking at data to improve the way that you're approaching the market. And there's AI companies there. I mentioned here Sorcera, which we took a look at. It's an early stage company that is working with pharmaceutical companies to better educate them about how to, or help them articulate the value proposition of their medicines to the right audience in a way that addresses that the audience needs. Software engineering, there are a number of companies. Software coding is a natural area, I think, for innovation here because it's an area with very structured data. Code has to have very specific syntax, and so it's a natural place where a lot of people are going to place bets, and we think it's going to make software development a lot more efficient, and over time, multiply the ability to create new software. And then R&D, where you're basically improving the way you're ideating, examining different data around product design, ideas, etc. So those are the areas. And I don't know if you have anything to add or if you agree with this, or Phil, I'd be interested in.
Yeah, just 2 things. You know, at the early stage, what folks initially went after was sales and marketing, software, as you mentioned, and other areas that have a large amount of unstructured data, so legal, compliance, healthcare. And I think there's tremendous opportunity in all of those. The other thing, I believe is that every category of software is going to get disrupted. And so it really gets back to my point on the data that's in the enterprise, 20% structured, 80% unstructured. Any company that's being driven on structured data, there's probably a lot of unstructured data that can be leveraged to enhance how you optimize that business process. And companies that currently are in the market will probably struggle to fully disrupt themselves to take advantage of that data. And so 10 years from now, my guess is every category of software, 10 to 20 years from now, will be disrupted.
Got it. Yeah, I think that makes sense. couple of other slides. So in terms of, we talked about functions. In terms of industries, I think we see a lot of potential in industries that have a lot of data and a lot of human labor operations. So banking, financial services, logistics and retail, healthcare, obviously real estate, insurance, and education. So all those are ripe. There's a lot of content on this slide. I'm not going to go more into that, but I think we covered a lot of the reasons why these might be attractive. So
Yeah.
at least in our firm, the way we're thinking about kind of potential investment in the Gen AI space is looking at applications, looking at fitting multiple of these frameworks, right? Attractive businesses with an attractive business model, addressing the right kind of functional areas in the right industries where the potential is much, much higher for extracting value. And then we addressed a little bit about this, but there's risks, right? And we talked about some of these, but there is churn. I think depending on the applications and the industry you're talking about, it sometimes is easy to flip vendors. There's incumbents that are going to use tools to try to defend their turf or evolve. And if they don't evolve, again, you have huge disruption opportunities. There's large foundational model players. There's obsolescence risks, company insourcing. So there's a lot of things that are happening. It's a very, and I will say, I mean, back to the discussion we're having, Phil, it's a very dynamic space that is evolving extremely fast, much faster than any of the other technologies, dating back to the .com, which was obviously something very new to most people, but it was almost like you could see where it was going. This one, I mean, you can see the potential, but it's the way that these models, and it's worth mentioning that it's not entirely clear how these models work, right? You have the technology, you have the neural networks, and you put the data in, and it's trying to replicate the human brain. And it's similar to, like, we don't exactly understand how the human brain works, but it's so how it evolves is very tough. And I think it's so that means that there are associated risks. In this area, actually, one of the questions that somebody asked is how prevalent and powerful are patents? Are you seeing patents as being an area of defensibility? I don't either. Do you want to talk about that?
No, I mean, I'm not saying it. But back to your point, I mean, this sector is moving so fast. It's insane. And your number one here is huge. Like, incumbents are not standing still at all, right? Like, they are investing heavily in this area. They are looking to adapt their solutions to these spaces. I still think there's opportunity for them to be disrupted in a lot of areas, but they aren't standing still at all.
Yeah. And if there are more questions around that, we can discuss it more. So feel free to submit them. The other thing we looked at is obviously a lot of interest and activity by VCs. This is not meant to be an exhaustive list here, but we just wanted to highlight a few of the firms that are being active. And, Phil's fund is obviously one of them. We see that we're seeing a lot of funds are partially, or in some cases, fully pivoting to address the opportunity in AI because of the factors that we talked about. And many of the top funds having an active interest in this area. And so it's going to be, whether you were doing fintech or, focusing in B2B SaaS, AI is going to penetrate everything, I feel. And I don't know if you're seeing this, Phil, but that's kind of the sense that we have when we talk to people. Everybody wants to look at, what's the AI angle for this business. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? How are you guys on the ground seeing it? How are you thinking about this?
Yeah, no, look, if you're a software investor anywhere up and down the stack, you're spending time on AI, right? Because it's enabling new workflows, new use cases. The other thing is that enterprises, so our customers, are seeking it out, right? And so,
Yeah.
when you talk to CIOs or CTOs at these organizations, the area within their budget that's growing is AI, right? So, in addition to the interest that you're seeing from the investment community, you're also seeing interest from the enterprises. And the reason is because it adds a tremendous amount of value to what they're doing, right? And so, I think that's going to lead to investors doubling down in this sector.
Yeah. And I think the other thing, I mean, we didn't go over the history of AI, but AI has been around for a while. So it's not like it's suddenly something new. I think generative AI in particular and the opportunities it presents is something new. But we went back and looked at our companies, and about 40% of them in our third fund were already kind of using AI, even not mentioning the specific. It's a toolkit, but generative AI in particular has awakened kind of this opportunity to improve efficiency, right? And any efficiency gains that you have are going to create value. And obviously, some maybe incumbents are going to be hurt, like we talked about. But I think it makes sense to pivot and look at it and be aggressive in it. And so that may speak to some of the the question that we had earlier. Are you going to have an over allocation where almost by definition, right? If everybody's looking at it and trying to throw money at it, I think there's going to be kind of this over investing, but I think it makes sense. The other page that we have here is the later stage funds that seem to be the most active right now in AI. And again, this is not meant to be in any way definitive list of groups that are doing AI, but just, Sam, when he was looking at we have access to PitchBook and other tools where you can see what people are investing in and being aggressive with. And so it's both early stage and later. Most of these are later stage investors.
The only thing to jump in on is the overinvestment question. And I think you're seeing, and I'm seeing it, like this really is going to be a $1 to $2 trillion opportunity annually, right? And so when you looked at your slides earlier, I think it showed what 50 billion being invested in the sector. Now, again, I am not saying that 50 billion was judiciously invested. Again, that first wave, I think there's going to be a lot of carnage among those companies. But my guess is when we look back and we look at the amount invested relative to the opportunity that those companies create over the next 10, 20, 30 years, I think the amount invested will be a fraction of the market value created by those companies.
Okay. I think, and this is kind of the last slide of content. There's on the last page, we have a link to all the various sources that Sam and I looked at, and you can peruse that. Again, we're going to make these slides available on LinkedIn. But we'll take some additional questions. We have another 6 minutes or so in our schedule. So if you have any questions, maybe give us let us know. But in the meantime, Phil, do you want to maybe talk about one or two companies that you saw that were doing something totally unique and different and interesting, and maybe give an example just to kind of get people thinking about what is possible?
Yeah, I can give two. One is a company that's in the gaming area. And what's interesting about it is they're creating sort of gaming storylines based on generative AI. I think what's really interesting about it is in the gaming context, hallucinations are a feature, not a bug, right? Because
Right.
in those cases, if you hallucinate and create something that folks aren't expecting, that can enhance gameplay as opposed to be a negative outcome for the user. And so it was interesting to see hallucinations as a feature, not a bug. And so I thought that was interesting. Another area that I think is quite interesting, it's early, but is the AI agent space. And so the AI agent space, there are companies that we're spending a lot of time on there. And an AI agent is a technology that interfaces with the environment multiple times. And so often folks call LLMs, the way we think about them, as being one shot. You prompt them and they respond. An AI agent actually tries to complete a task for you. So it interfaces with the environment comes back, it takes that, response and then goes back. And so it tries to, let's say, purchase something on behalf of its user. That space is very early because you can imagine that if LLMs hallucinate one shot, if they're interfacing with the environment multiple times, the success rate goes down, right? But it's an area of real interest. There's an open source project called Open Devon that's creating agents in the coding space that's very exciting. And so those are two of the areas that I think are pretty interesting.
Yeah, and I thought what we might finish was obviously when you talk about AI, there's, more macro questions and kind of almost like public policy type of questions like, what does that mean for people's jobs, right? So, um, I'll give my take and I'd love to hear kind of how you're thinking about that. I think if you look historically, dating back to kind of the Industrial Revolution, you cannot stop technological advance, right? If you kind of stop and say, no, we need to take a more conservative approach, somebody else is going to surpass you, which is what happened with the US surpassing England, which was the dominant force in textile production back in the 1800s, right? And then, um, and there's always, and what comes from productivity is that maybe some people will lose their job, but I think they might be doing some different jobs that are now created maybe more efficiently or they enjoy it better. So like even, I talked about RAD AI earlier when where we invested. So we're asking questions about productivity. How does that help the radiologist be more productive, et cetera, et cetera. And what they're doing is they're taking like the language that he uses to write his reports, taking the transcripts and auto-generating the report in his language before he has to. And so we were dialing into, gee, isn't this, what's the productivity? And yeah, that's an important question, but you also have to think about, the primary reason why radiologists burn out is because they hate this part of the job, writing the report, right? And so there are other issues. And so you're making jobs, people's jobs more enjoyable, right? Or you can now expand that service because they're more efficient to a wider set of patients, maybe more cheaply, right? So I think it's important to keep kind of an upside. So I don't know if that's how you think about it or if you have another take.
No, it is. And, I often think about the introduction of the car to sort of frame it. And so, like, when you think about it, when the car came out, right, uh, you could see how it would disrupt the horse, the buggy, that sort of thing, because it's something that the replacement aspect is very tangible and it's something that you can understand. What's much harder is to see how the car changes commerce over time, right? You're not going to envision that, right? You're not going to envision the creation of suburbs, you know, uh, the way it's going to impact, the um, supply chain, and you're just not thinking like that when the
Right.
new technology comes out. And so, I think with generative AI, we're at that point, right, where the new technology comes out, and it's easy to see how it could impact certain roles and certain jobs. What's much harder to see is how it will open up new areas that we never thought about. I mean, one that you can think about, today is within, the biotech space and the fact that it may lead to folks living longer. And if folks live longer, the healthcare system needed to support it may grow. And so you could envision that, but there will be a number of other implications to this technology and new industries that are created that we just can't envision right now.
Yeah. Well, this is obviously very topical also because Apple announced this week that they're introducing AI, or as they call it, Apple Intelligence in their phones. And one question is, what does this mean? Um, I don't know that it means particularly anything other than that it's going to get more embedded into what consumers experience day to day. It's going to make your interaction with the phone hopefully easier, right? We have to see it, obviously. I think they're doing it in a smart way, which is weaving it into all their products. But they're also, coming a little bit from behind, which Apple has done occasionally. to try to catch up to make it more available to consumers. So I think it's a good thing, and it shows that this, will affect every company. Apple is not beyond it, and they always used AI, but it's just generative AI. I think means that they're advancing. Somebody's also asking about no action on patents, really. So I think there's obviously going to be attempts to patent some part of basic technology, right? So we're not saying that people are not going to patent technological innovation here, but I think at least in businesses that we have seen, most of the advantage comes from know-how and kind of proprietary approach to doing things as opposed to something that you're going to patent. So I don't know if you want to speak to that a little bit, because obviously clearly a question on people's minds.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. It's not to say that, clearly there's a lot of patent activity. It's just not what we're seeing in the companies that we back. And what we specifically mean is that the barrier to entry that a company is leveraging often isn't patents. It's know-how, it's understanding of the market, et cetera. And then just on the Apple point, I agree with your comment. But it's significant, right? Because they're such a large consumer company, and the distribution that they have is just massive. And so, when you think about the way these models work, as Thanasis mentioned, they're not programmed, they're trained. And so access to data is critical. And so, I think this announcement from Apple does really two things. One, it's going to put generative AI applications in the hands of consumers. And two, it's going to generate more data for companies like OpenAI, which will probably enhance the lead they already have. And so I think it's a significant moment.
Yeah, how do you think about, and we'll finish with this. Privacy is obviously something important, right? And Apple, because you have data now that are all over the internet, right? And Apple is taking the position that, privacy, we're going to make that our banner when we talk to consumers about all these software. And obviously they can do that because a lot of the value comes from other services and hardware. I think it's harder for Google to do that, but so they are clearly playing the privacy. And when you saw even how they launched the AI, which is, when it needs more important, higher powered compute, it goes out to the private compute cloud, which they're hosting. And then they're going to, they have the partnership with OpenAI. And sometimes, when I'm signed up, as I'm sure you are, in ChatGPT as a subscriber, and I use this, and you feed it all this data, and it's clearly data that OpenAI has. How do you worry about privacy? And obviously, the enterprise, consumers one thing, and then you have the enterprise, which is a whole different other ball game. So how do you think about that? Should companies operate? Is it a big deal, or should we just, is OpenAI gonna be tapped and spy into us, or how do you process that?
Massive issue, right? And so that was another aspect of the announcement that I thought was super interesting. Like, what are they going to do on the edge? What are they going to do on the device? And then what are they going to do in the private cloud? And how are they going to manage between that? Like, just thinking through all of that at scale is going to be fascinating. And to your point, at the heart of all of this is privacy, right? And so, I think it's super early days in figuring that out. And I think consumers are going to care. And we already know enterprises care. There's a lot of investment going into security, privacy, governance, helping large organizations manage their data and ensure that their data isn't used to train models that other people can use. And so I think that's a really interesting area of investment right now.
Excellent. And with that, I think we've come to the end of our hour. And thank you, Phil. Really appreciate you being here as an expert and somebody with kind of on-the-ground experience at the early stage. We're going to do this again with some other sectors. And again, as I said, we're going to share the recording of this webinar and the slides with anybody who wants to peruse them on LinkedIn. Thanks again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. Cheers.